Well, hi there, and welcome to the short webinar where I'm going to be discussing what you need to know if you're a cattle producer who is currently confining cattle or who wants or needs to confine cattle either temporarily or permanently. My name is Amy Schmidt, and I'm a faculty member in the departments of Biological Systems Engineering and Animal Science at UNL. I am a livestock bioenvironmental engineer, and I work with manure and animal byproduct management. This presentation is designed to help you decide what steps you need to take from a regulatory standpoint if you're interested in confining cattle either temporarily or for a longer term. I'm going to talk about some situations where you don't currently confine cattle but may begin confining them based on a temporary need or a desire to convert to a confinement system, as well as situations where you are currently confining cattle without needing a permit, or you're currently permitted but are considering expanding your confined herd. I want to share with you some of the factors that determine whether or not you need a site inspection and or a permit, as well as talk about how long you can keep cattle temporarily confined without needing to pursue an inspection or permit. I want to talk about what you need to do if you determine that your situation does require an inspection or a permit, and then finally talk about what other rules or considerations might apply to your particular situation. So I think the first important thing to talk about is how regulators define an animal feeding operation versus a concentrated animal feeding operation. So an animal feeding operation, or an AFO, is a situation where animals, one or more animals, are confined for at least 45 days to an area where vegetation is not sustained in the normal growing season. So this is a system that's officially termed an animal feeding operation, or an AFO. Once a system is defined as an AFO, it can then be further defined as a CAFO, or a concentrated animal feeding operation, based on either the number of animals confined or based on the operation's potential to discharge contaminants to water bodies, or a past incidence of discharging contaminants. And so being an AFO that is below the size requirement for a CAFO, being defined as a CAFO based on your discharge or potential to discharge, is termed being designated a CAFO by the regulatory agency. So basically, to go from an AFO to a CAFO, you either have to have a certain number of animals confined or be designated as a pollution risk by the regulatory agency. So Nebraska's regulatory definition of AFOs and CAFOs mirrors the federal regulation, and this is a requirement of any state level regulation. Essentially, state regulations have to be at least as strict as federal regulations, and there are situations where states may choose to be more strict than the federal regulation. So in Nebraska, an operation that confines fewer than 300 cattle or cow-calf pairs for 45 days or more in an area that cannot sustain vegetation during the normal growing season would be considered a small AFO. A medium AFO then is an operation that meets these same standards but has somewhere between 300 and 999 animals or cow-calf pairs. And then once an animal feeding operation confines 1,000 or more animals, it becomes a CAFO based solely on its size. Now, you recall that I mentioned that an AFO can be designated as a CAFO by the regulatory agency if they have experienced a discharge in the past. So a smaller medium AFO can become a smaller medium CAFO based on that designation by the DEQ. And I'll talk more as we go along about what might impact a designation of that nature a little bit later in the presentation. For now, though, it's important to know that if you are a small AFO, meaning you have fewer than 300 animals confined, then there aren't any requirements for an inspection or a permit unless you have a potential to discharge pollutants. If you confine more than 300 animals but fewer than 1,000, you are a medium AFO, And once you become a medium AFO, you need to request an inspection of your site by the DEQ prior to constructing that confined cattle area. And likewise, if you're currently a large CAFO because you can find 1,000 or more animals, then any expansion to your operation would require that you modify your existing permit. Now, there are inspection fees associated with having a site inspection done, and those are shown here at the bottom of the screen, and they're dependent on the size of that animal feeding operation. And then there's also a form available through the DEQ that is an official form for requesting the inspection of an animal feeding operation. So I'm going to cover some specifics of manure management, and I want to show some different scenarios that illustrate when an inspection or a permit may be needed. But I think the point that all of the regulation encompasses as a whole is that manure should be recognized as a source of nutrients, and as such it's a potential pollutant to surface waters. So as long as you're keeping manure contained, regardless of the size of the operation, you really should be in pretty good shape from a regulatory standpoint. With manure, it simply can't be discharged to waters of the state from the production area. And so this means that manure from confined animals shouldn't be allowed to freely flow away from a confinement area. The confinement area should not have a ditch or any sort of pipe running away from it that would discharge to a creek or other water body. And really the size of the animal feeding operation is irrelevant if there's a discharge from that confinement system. The regulation says you can't discharge to waters of the state. So what exactly does that mean? What are waters of the state? In the simplest terms, it's really anything other than a manure containment structure that water could flow to. So farm ponds, road ditches, any dry or intermittent streams. One of the things to remember is that we are looking at a revision to the federal regulation of waters of the U.S., or the WOTUS rule, you may have heard it called. So some of these definitions of waters of the state or waters of the U.S. may change when that rule is finalized. And we're expecting to see a finalized rule published in the Federal Register sometime in the late spring or early summer of this year. So, so this definition could change. So I want to look at a few different scenarios that involve taking cattle from a pasture-based system to a confinement system. And hopefully one of the scenarios I cover will address your specific situation or something very similar. So in this first scenario, let's assume that a farmer has 450 cattle or cow-calf pairs on pasture and wants to confine them for a month out of the year to supplement feed. So because they are confined for fewer than 45 days, regardless of the number of animals, this would not qualify as an animal feeding operation, so there wouldn't be any need for an inspection or a permit. Likewise, if those animals were going to be kept in the feeding area for greater than 45 days, say maybe 90 days, but there's an ability to leave a gate open to give those animals access to pasture, they technically wouldn't be considered confined. So again, this particular operation would not be considered an AFO, or an animal feeding operation. My recommendation in this type of situation would be to make sure that you're hauling any accumulated manure as needed so you don't experience a discharge from the site. That sort of a discharge could trigger a complaint from a neighbor, or possibly give the DEQ a reason to come out and do an inspection of the site and possibly designate it as a CAFO due to that potential to discharge pollutants. You also want to remember that with any confinement area, you really should not be situating that next to a stream or a pond. It shouldn't have any sort of ditch or other conveyance flowing through it that would carry manure away. Just being careful to not have a potential to discharge would be your best bet in this situation. So the next situation or scenario is similar to the one we just looked at, but now if we consider we have those same 450 cattle, they're confined in an area for more than 45 days, and you cannot leave the gate open for them to have access to pasture. So in this situation, you have become an AFO, or an animal feeding operation, simply based on the fact that the animals are totally confined to that lot for more than 45 days. If the number of animals that you have confined is less than 300, you would be considered a small AFO, and you would not have any requirement to request an inspection. There would be no requirement for a permit. And really the only reason DEQ might have to visit the site or do an inspection would be if they receive a complaint or have a suspicion that you're discharging pollutants or have proof of a previous discharge. In this situation, if you had between 300 and 999 animals in this lot, you would be considered a medium animal feeding operation, and you would need to request an inspection. And in this situation, it would really be up to the NDEQ to determine if the inspection is necessary, if this is a temporary situation. And you wouldn't likely be required to have a permit simply based on size of the operation. Any requirement for a permit would really be based on the way the manure is managed and being able to show that you don't have a potential to discharge. So some of the ways in this situation that you could avoid having to request an inspection, one would be to reduce the period of confinement to fewer than 45 days if that's possible for your particular situation. Another would be to contain the animals in a lot area that provides for a much lower stocking density than you typically see in a true feedlot situation. And the reason for this would be that if your stocking density is lower, you could probably maintain a little more vegetation on the lot and maybe avoid being considered an actual feedlot situation. So if you can use a large enough area to allow vegetation to keep growing, you may be able to get by with not technically being a confinement operation. So these last two examples that are shown on this one slide describe situations where you would definitely need to request an inspection and may need to apply for a permit or a permit modification. So in the top example, you would consider that you would be deciding to confine cattle for more than 45 days, and you would have a true feedlot situation. So the stocking density is such that you can't maintain vegetation on that site. If you have more than 1,000 animals in this situation, you would definitely need to request an inspection. And if the DEQ determines you have the potential to discharge pollutants, then a permit would be required. And in most situations, based simply on the size, you would probably be looking at a permit. There's few situations where an open feedlot can show that it doesn't have the potential to discharge. If you had between 300 and 999 animals, like in the previous example, you would still need to request an inspection. You could be required to get a permit if you have the potential to discharge. Again, this kind of comes back to picking an appropriate site and managing the manure correctly. At the same time, if you currently have livestock confined and you're already operating under a permit and you simply want to add more animals to confinement, your permit conditions would require that you notify the DEQ that you are looking to expand, and you would need to apply for a permit modification. So what should you do if you think that based on these different scenarios we've discussed that you may need an inspection or permit? You can contact the DEQ at their state office in Lincoln, and I've shown the address and phone number for them here on the screen. And they'll be able to help you decide what steps are required for your particular situation. You also would have a regional DEQ inspector in your area that could be contacted. Or you can certainly contact Nebraska Extension for assistance, and we'd be happy to help you kind of navigate the regulatory requirement. Some of the things that you would want to consider related to manure management, you definitely want to locate your temporary lot or your permanent lot away from any sensitive areas, and that's to avoid the potential for having runoff or discharge to waters of the state. We always want to make sure that we're scraping manure and either applying it right away or stockpiling it for later land application. And it may be necessary to construct a temporary catchment basin to collect runoff, to use some sort of vegetative treatment area to apply that runoff to on a regular basis, or be prepared to pump or haul that runoff when it occurs. If a discharge occurs, whether you have a permit or not, you really need to report that incident to the DEQ within 24 hours. And a permit would require that you provide a written report to them within 5 days as well. So a couple of caveats based on the size of your operation. For small or medium animal feeding operations, the regulatory code for the state indicates that you shouldn't stockpile or apply manure within 30 feet of a down gradient water body. So this would include any streams, lakes, or other impounded waters. For a large CAFO, that setback is greater. In that case, you shouldn't stockpile or apply manure within 100 feet of a down gradient water body or other sensitive area, unless you maintain a 35-foot vegetated buffer along or around these sensitive areas. Or the other option is that you could utilize another conservation practice as opposed to using the 35-foot vegetated buffer. And you need to be able to provide satisfactory evidence to the DEQ that shows that this alternative practice performs as good as or better than the buffers or setbacks that are required. Okay, so I've talked about the regulatory definitions of AFOS and CAFOs. We talked about reasons why an operation might be designated as a CAFO even if the quantity of animals is below the regulatory threshold of 1,000 animals for being a CAFO. And I've talked about some specific scenarios where an inspection or a permit might be needed. What I kind of want to leave you with is what I consider the bottom line regarding permits and manure management. If you need to temporarily confine cattle, you can keep that confinement period below 45 days to avoid being an AFO. If that isn't possible, then if you're confining fewer than 300 animals, you'd be below the threshold for needing an inspection and possibly a permit. And finally, if you have a situation where you can avoid completely confining the animals by leaving a gate open for them to have access to pasture, then again you avoid becoming an AFO and having those requirements for an inspection or a permit. If you currently have a permit or you meet any of the requirements I've talked about for needing a permit, then you'll need to revise your existing permit or obtain a new one based on your situation. And again, contacting your regional DEQ inspector or the state office or UNL Extension are your options for kind of navigating the requirements from a regulatory standpoint. Finally, the thing I want to leave you with is that regardless of whether or not you're operating under a permit or will need to have a permit to establish some temporary confinement, the bottom line is really that you need to manage the manure to avoid discharges. Water quality protection is really the basis for these regulations, and that should be your goal as a livestock producer, regardless of the size or type of your operation. So it's not really about avoiding a permit or avoiding an inspection, although those are things that in a temporary situation you might want to try to avoid those. But it's really about managing your manure appropriately and not having discharges or pollution of water. So with that, if you have any questions or you need further information or clarification on anything in the presentation, please don't hesitate to contact me. My information is at the bottom of the screen there, email, phone number, and name and address and everything. I'm happy to help you out any way I can. And like I said, any of your DEQ regional or state level folks could help you out as well, and you can also contact your local Nebraska Extension office for assistance too.